It starts theological in Acts 6 when there were racial injustices happening in the Jewish majority church where Greek-speaking widows were being neglected in the distribution of food and the pastoral care system. The all-Jewish leadership appointed an all Greek-speaking diaconate, as some have called it, or basically you handle it. Here are the resources. You tell us what needs to be done, and we're going to get behind your lead. Handing over the microphone and the leadership table. Especially in those areas where the injustice is the greatest and felt and experienced the greatest. Hand it over. Don't just say, we'd like to hear your perspective and we'll take it under advisement. No, hand it over. What does that look like? Again, the microphone. The first step to becoming a multi-ethnic church is to hire a person who is not a majority culture person in your church community, a person of color. In my case, for instance, we hired a professor from Vanderbilt named Paul Lim, who friend of Sun Chun Ra, who taught for a number of years at Gordon Conwell. He's now at Vanderbilt. He's our scholar in residence. He's one of the most beloved teachers in our community, and he preaches to our church, and he preaches second only to me in terms of frequency, as a part-time staff member. And part of that is just he's a genius, regardless of what what his ethnic makeup is, but there's also an intentionality about hiring a person of color to be a major voice of influence and a platformed voice of influence in our particular space. And I mentioned our women's ministry as well. They've engaged several women who are either deeply invested personally in minority concerns as white people, or minority leaders, who they've brought them into this sort of leadership team, and then they've also brought in some people even from outside of our church to consult in and to speak at events and things like that. And what our women's ministry has done is they've sort of negotiated this safe space of dialogue between what amounts to about 50% white and 50% women of color, and right now it's just women. But it's just an example of one of the ripples of our emphasis, what the preaching has led to, and so they're just starting to form more intentional community, getting into each other's spaces and doing a lot of listening in both directions. And it's in the sort of earlier stages of the process, but trust is building, and a sense of a vision for something new and different and more together is starting to form as well. Our city is racially divided. Nashville, a lot like Austin, is known as a city on the rise, an it city or what have you. Like New York and LA are calling it the third coast because of all the coastal migration and everything. But the understory, especially if you're black, is that so much of this is that's happening. What has to happen in order for this to happen is this in the black community, because through gentrification that does not account for, you're not making the neighborhood better by just making crime go down and houses look prettier because you've displaced one population with a new suburban population that wants to feel cool and say they live in the city. If I can be just as brash and snarky as I can, you're not an urbanite if you're just a white gentrifier that comes into a formerly urban space. You are a person who's changed a neighborhood. You've turned an urb into a suburb is what you've done. It's just a different location. So soapbox, stepping off of that right now. But the question needs to be asked, and does that mean we repudiate, gentrification? It's just all wrong to go in and rehab homes and that sort of thing? No, but what we have to do is ask the question, like if you got real estate developers or whatever that are in this space, like what does a just way of doing this look like? What does it look like for the tide to rise for everybody and not just for those who move in? What does it look like for the tide to rise for everybody, including and especially the minority families who've lived there for years and years and years and generations? And those answers are more complicated, but they're achievable. But it takes sacrifice and it takes personal cost, and that's where the church comes in. Because I don't know if without the Spirit you can have the will to really love your neighbor as yourself, to be just as committed to my neighbors having a beautiful quality of life in this neighborhood as we do as we move into it. I like what New York City does, where if a neighborhood does get gentrified, I mean, they don't, by and large, they don't take the public housing out of the neighborhood. It becomes more integrated. Also, the new buildings, they have a certain percentage of the apartments that you're required, if you're going to put up a new residential building, you're required to have a certain percentage of apartments that are affordable to lower income and families and individuals. And so just thinking creatively like that and learning from cities that are not content with displacing people and just fighting for the tide to rise for everyone. I mean, I'm not an expert on these things, but bottom line, if your minority neighbors are mostly sad and angry at the sight of you, chances are there's probably something unjust going on. Open our ears and look to minorities for solutions. They know their communities better than majority culture do as well. And read Brian Fickert's When Helping Hurts if you haven't yet. So.